Good evening, and welcome to the third, not in the book. It's the fourth in the book, but it's the third overall. The third ghost story. Now, it should, if I was doing them, it should have been Nesbit's The Shadow, but I've found out that I've already read it, and it's either from the book in my folder on my YouTube site, Classic Ghost Stories, or Tales from the Dead of Night. I can't remember which one, but so tonight's story is This Beautiful House by Louis de Bernieres. And I've just tried to find out. I've read the introduction. It says in the introduction, Louis de Bernieres' My Beautiful House is an oddity, a supernatural story told with an admirable lightness of touch that turns out to be more interested in heart-tugging melancholy than in bald horror. So, Nesbit's Shadow is one of the classics. But This Beautiful House by Louis de Bernieres sounds to me like a good one. So let's see. So, This Beautiful House. I love it at Christmas. I just sit here at the end of the garden on top of the rockery like a garden gnome. I don't find the stones uncomfortable. I sit here and look at the house. It's very beautiful. I always did think so. I grew up here, and I am still here now, although I spend much of my time out in the garden just looking. Sorry. Other people may not think it beautiful, but it's beautiful to me mainly because I always loved it. I loved my childhood in this house, and I loved it when I had to go abroad on military service because, it represented everything I was fighting for. And I loved it when I came back to, notwithstanding, from Korea, and settled into the life I was born to. Here is the clump of bamboos behind which I used to conceal myself when playing hide and seek with my brothers and sister. Further up there on the left is a bird table that I made when I was at school. It's amazing that it hasn't rotted away by now. The lawn isn't very smooth, there's too much couch grass, but we used to set up a putting green on it in the summer, and it ruined my father's scores at the real golf course because he kept hitting the ball a long way past the hole. Here is the big apple tree that was so easy to climb and produced great bramleys that my mother made into pies. One year we tried to make cider, but it was very sharp. We had rabbits in the orchard in a big wire enclosure that was movable. They kept the grass mown if you remembered to move the cage around. Of course, they'd escape quite often by burrowing underneath, and they'd go and raid the vegetable patch, but they came when you called them anyway. The cage started life as a chicken run, but we found them too ill-natured. There used to be a modest fruit cage just here as well, and I often had to go into it to free the robins and blackbirds that got stuck inside. They would fly about in a silly panic and didn't know you were trying to be helpful. Funny kind of fruit cage, my father used to say. Keep birds in instead of out. The house isn't very old. It's Edwardian. And it's made of nice red bricks with tiles coming halfway down the walls in the Surrey farmhouse style. I remember when the Virginia creeper and the wisteria were planted, and now they're all over the walls. I don't know who the architect was, but it's a very conventional design. Most of the other family houses around here are quite similar. The first people to live here came down from the north. I think they were in textiles. Then it belonged to a writer who was quite famous in his time, but now no one's even heard of him. Then it belonged to a retired naval officer and his wife, and then it was ours. I have so many happy memories, I don't ever want to leave. Inside there were about 5 bedrooms. My parents had the one at the back. Mine was above the kitchen. Every morning the smell of frying eggs and sausages would get me out of bed in a good mood. My room wasn't big, but it was big enough for my model aeroplanes to hang from the ceiling on string, and for my toy soldiers to have decent-sized battles. I had a little cannon that worked on a spring, and you could put ball bearings or matches into it, pull back the lever, release it, and mow down the troops. When I grew up, I would find little ball bearings all over the place. My brother Michael shared a room with my other brother Sebastian. They were twins, but not identical. My sister Catherine had the room opposite my parents', and sometimes I would creep into her room at night with a sheet over my head and give her a fright, or I'd listen for when she went to the loo, and I'd lie down at the corner of the corridor and grab her ankle as she went past in the dark. It worked every time. Then my mother told me to stop doing it, because it was unnerving being woken up by screaming in the middle of the night. Catherine used to get revenge by leaning over the banisters of the landing and spitting on my head when I was underneath in the hallway. It's hard to imagine that she grew up to be so beautiful and refined and married a baronet. On the top floor up the back stairs under the roof is a lovely big dusty attic. I think it had been fitted out for a servant to live in, because it had a proper little fireplace and the rafters were all boarded in. I spent hours up there. I fixed a dartboard to the wall and I threw darts at it, backhand, underarm, over my shoulder, every possible way. I got very good at it. It was one of my party tricks. I used to go up there when I was miserable as well, because no one would know I was weeping. I always liked the bells. You'd press a button on the wall in any room and it would ring in the pantry, and a little brown semaphore would wave back and forth in a box above the door and indicate which room you were ringing from. Catherine and I used to push the buttons to make my mother go to the front door and find nobody there. Once we did it, and my mother went to the door, and when she opened it, the cat was sitting there on the mat in the porch, looking up at her as if he'd pressed it himself. The cat just walked past her into the hallway, and my mother was astonished for a short time, until she realised that it couldn't possibly have been Tobermory that rang the bell. Tobermory was named after a talking cat in a story that my father read to us once. The moral of the story was that if you can't talk, it's better not to tell the truth. Our phone number was 293. Amazing when you consider how long the numbers are nowadays. I love sitting here at Christmas time at the end of the garden. I don't feel the cold. I like to sit here because the house looks so wonderful with the Christmas tree behind the French windows. There's a full moon, and I can see everything around me with perfect clarity. The stars are out, and I can never remember which ones are the planets. Perhaps they're the very bright ones. Sebastian used to point them out to me, but I don't know how he knew. I used to point them out to girlfriends when I was being romantic, but I was bluffing. I knew that they didn't know either. The house and the garden and the sky looked like something out of a Christmas card, appropriately enough. The only thing missing is snow. I only ever remember one white Christmas, when it snowed as we came out of church, and Catherine was wearing a lilac coat with a hood that had a lining of white rabbit fur that framed her face and made me think that she was the prettiest sister that anyone ever had. Everything is silver and shadow now, except for the Christmas tree, which is glowing with all sorts of different coloured lights that reflect off the tinsel and the glass balls. It reminds me, it can't be helped, of that dreadful night of the fire. We had little candles in those days, little candles that sat on cups that clipped to the branches of the Christmas tree, along with all the tatty taffeta angels that we'd inherited. It looked magical, but it wasn't ever a good idea. The trees dry out and they're full of resin. They go up like a torch. We all went to midnight mass, and when we got home we had a nightcap. We talked about plans for Christmas Day. My father used to like to go shooting, but my mother more or less forbade him. She said it wasn't nice to go round bowling over rabbits and blasting birds out of the sky on the day when our Saviour was born to bring peace and harmony to the world. We decided we'd all walk to Abbott's Notwithstanding and back again before lunch, but my mother would have to drop out because someone had to baste the goose. I think she was probably relieved because she wasn't a great one for unnecessary exercise. The whole family were there, including the Baronet. We liked the Baronet. He didn't put on any airs, and he didn't have any side. He had a quiet charm and a confidence. He gave up the army for Catherine's sake, because she didn't want to have to be sent off all over the world at a moment's notice. It was decent of him because he was a Coldstreamer. He was doing well, and he obviously loved it. He and Catherine came down from Cambridgeshire in the Riley to be with us for Christmas. Sebastian and Michael came down from Merton, and I was living at home anyway because I'd always loved that house and didn't want to move anywhere else, not unless I married, and anyway I'd found a decent job in Guildford. I paid rent to my mother without my father knowing, which seemed the best thing. Knowing her, she spent the money on shoes. That night, what with us being tired and having a tot of whisky inside us, we forgot to put out the candles on the tree, just as anyone might, but the next thing I knew I woke up choking. I got out of bed, hacking and coughing, and I groped about in the smoke, but I couldn't find the light switch, and there was a terrible pain in my lungs, and I was coughing so much that it was agony. I felt that I was vomiting my lungs up. My eyes stung so badly from the smoke that I couldn't open them, and even so they were still streaming with tears. I remember the pain, the coughing, the stinging in my eyes, and the insuperable fear, the not knowing where I was in the room, the roaring noise. And then it was as if my chest and my brain were full of molten lead, and I must have passed out. I don't really know what happened next. As I sit here at the end of the garden, on the rockery looking at the Christmas tree with its electric lights, it's hard to believe that the house is almost gutted. The tree must have set the curtains alight and so on. Anyway, it's all been repaired and you'd never know that anything happened. It's part of the wonder of the house. It doesn't die, it just keeps on evolving. The house is alive. It watches over me always, and it's watching me now as I sit here, not feeling the cold, looking at it from the end of the garden. The house may be alive, but my family aren't. They all perished in the fire, from inhaling the smoke, every one of them, including the cat. Even so, it doesn't stop them turning up. Just now my father put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Come on, my boy." Death hasn't changed him at all. He's just as solid. He's still got the same voice and even the same smell of free nuns' navy cut pipe tobacco. He still smokes a pipe. He wears the +4s and long socks and brogues that I used to find so embarrassing and old-fashioned. Every time I sit here he comes and asks me to leave. I wish he wouldn't. I love him, but he isn't entitled to tell me what to do anymore. They're all here now, as solid and real as when they were alive. There's Catherine and her Baronet, hand in hand, and Sebastian and Michael looking at me pityingly. There's even the cat. It's not Tobermory. This one is Gerald, and he was 2 cats later. Gerald used to drink from the dripping tap in the bathroom basin, whereas Tobermory would get under the sofa, stick his claws into the hessian underneath, and drag himself along on his back as fast as he could go. Gerald settles on his haunches and looks up at me with interest as if I were an experiment. My mother is here too. She reaches out a hand to try to take mine and says, "Please, darling, please," but I take my hand away, not roughly but gently. I know she loves me, you see, and I don't want to cause her any hurt. She implores me with her eyes and still holds out her hand. "Come on, you big fool," says Sebastian, grinning like a big schoolboy, and Michael thumps me on the shoulder with the same old fraternal violence and says, "Come on, old thing, you've been here quite long enough." "I'm watching the house," I say. The baronet lights a cigarette, and when he throws the match to the ground, it disappears. "Look," he says, "I know I'm not strictly family and what not, only being married in, as it were, but you've got to give it up one of these days, this watching over the house lark." "It's really the house watching over me," I say. "Anyway, you're all dead." "When are you going to understand?" asks Catherine, shaking her head. "What's wrong with staying here?" I say. "Please," says my mother. After a while they leave one by one, as they always do. My mother and Catherine give me a gentle kiss on the cheek. It's surprising how you can distinctly feel the kiss of someone who is dead. My father once surprised me by taking my head between his hands and kissing me on the forehead. He would never have done that when he was alive, and he hasn't done it since. Michael and Sebastian subject me to more claps between the shoulder blades. They all turn and wave modestly before they fade away, not far from where the bonfire always used to be. Only Gerald stays a little while. He winds himself around my legs a few times and reaches up to touch a claw to my hand, as he used to when he suspected that it contained a morsel of cheddar cheese. After a while he wanders away after the rest of them. I don't understand why they keep coming back. I am glad to see them, of course, but they are dead. I keep telling them, but they don't seem to be able to take it in. They don't seem to understand why I won't go with them. Perhaps death makes you less perceptive. Anyway, I am perfectly contented here, sitting atop this rockery by moonlight, not even feeling the cold, looking at the trees sparkling with so many colours in the French window. I love it here. I love this beautiful house. I love the way it holds me as if it had hands and I was cupped inside them. I sit here and it watches over me. I feel absolute happiness, and there's nothing I'd rather do.